viral variants and vaccines, and the intersection between the two, on this episode of Shareable Science Beyond the Blog. Welcome to Shareable Science. Science you can share. Before we jump into the science, let's use an analogy to set the stage. I want you to imagine 3 students that have taken a world history course. And these 3 students have taken this course in different parts of the country. So one of the students lives in Canada, one in Egypt, and one, say, in New Zealand. And they've all taken the course within the last year, but student number 1 took it in April, student number 2 in October, and student number 3 finished just a couple of weeks ago. To pass the course, all the students have to have at least a 70 as their final grade. They all took the same tests, but they had different teachers. They took it at different times. Here are their final grades. Before we automatically say student number 1 is the better student and student number 3 is the worst student, there's a lot of context we would have to dig into around that. The fact that they took them in different countries, different cultures, different teachers at different time points. For example, student number 3 might have had their internet shut down while they were partway through the final exam. And student number 1, who took the course back in April when the world was on lockdown, might have been able to take the final as an open book test. So there's a lot of context before we try to rank what these different scores mean. But they all scored above the minimum threshold of 70, so every single one of them passed the course. That's the concept I want you to take into the next conversation with this set of numbers. There are 2 vaccines that have already been approved in the United States for emergency use authorization, and there are 3 more that are on the horizon to come to the FDA for approval. You can go back and look at the January 12th Beyond the Blog video for the biology of these 3, but they've all within the last few days released data about their clinical trials. And I'm showing you the efficacy of these different vaccines and vaccine candidates in preventing moderate or severe COVID-19 disease. That's our threshold. Do they prevent moderate or severe COVID-19 disease? And what you can see is that some of the more recent ones, actually their efficacy depends on the country in which the clinical trial was run. And some of that is explained by the different types of SARS-CoV-2 variants that we're now seeing around the world. That some of these variants have different impacts on how well the vaccine does its job. More on that on the flip side of this board. But the point that I want to make is that we can't simply say, oh, these are better vaccines than these. These clinical trials were run when there weren't those kinds of variants. So this is like comparing apples to oranges. They're not testing for efficacy against the exact same type of the virus. They're run under different conditions. It's also important to note that some of these have significant advantages. They aren't required to be stored at minus 80 degrees like the mRNA vaccines are. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single dose. So you get twice as many vaccinated from the same set of doses. So just making a comparison against better or worse based on efficacy numbers doesn't make sense. It's not the right way to think about it. And just like all 3 of these students passed the final exam, every single one of these vaccine candidates meets the goal of reducing the severity of COVID-19 illness. That means more people live for another birthday. Fewer people go in the hospital, fewer people go on ventilators. So they all have met the required endpoint. I just want you to be careful as you try to rank them, that you at least think about some of the contextual pieces behind them. All right, let's shift gears from vaccines to the variants that those vaccines are trying to create immunity against. Early in January, we had another Shareable Science where we talked about some of these variants and what these variants of concern mean. All viruses undergo mutation as they evolve. That's expected. We've got 3 variants that have been classified as variants of concern because the specific changes that they contain seem to impact their ability to infect other people, the severity, or their response to an immunity built in around it. Here are the scientific names of those variants. You know them by their location. The UK variant, the South African variant, and then the newest one is the Brazilian variant. We don't have a whole lot of data around the Brazilian variant, so I'm just going to acknowledge up front that much of what is on this board is based on very little information where that variant is concerned. We're going to look at two things, the first being transmissibility. So how easily does this variant or these variants spread within a population compared to the previous versions of the SARS-CoV-2 virus? There's pretty clear data that the UK variant spreads more easily, maybe 30 to 60% more transmissible. The same seems to be true of the South African variant. Possibly for Brazilian, we've got to study that. There's also some early data that suggests that the UK variant may not only spread more easily, but it may lead to a more severe form of the disease. That's one study. I'm going to kind of set that to the side until we've got more data around that. But clearly, these variants spread more easily. Now let's talk about something called immune evasion. Immune evasion simply asks the question, do the immune responses that we are creating with a vaccine or having already been infected with the virus, are those immune responses going to hold against these new variants? So you're looking to see about the level of antibodies, the effectiveness of antibodies that you've generated because you've already had the virus, or maybe because you've been immunized. The UK variant responds to those antibodies the same way that all of the previous versions do. So there doesn't seem to be any issue of evading the immune system for that variant. That's not necessarily the case for the South African variant. Whether we're talking about the antibody response from someone who's been vaccinated, the antibody response from someone who's already had the virus, or the antibody response if you give somebody monoclonal antibodies as a therapy, this variant seems to be less responsive, seems to be neutralized less by these antibodies. Now, less responsive doesn't mean unresponsive. There still is an immune response. It still does its job, but it is less effective, or it potentially takes higher amounts of antibodies to generate that same response. We don't have the data yet on the Brazilian variant as it relates to immune evasiveness, but the South African evasiveness seems to be caused by one specific mutation called E484K. And that same variant is found in the Brazilian version. So it's possible we'll see evasion here as well. So what do we make of this? Well, clearly these variants are spreading more quickly. So we've got to do all the things we've historically done around masking and social distancing and staying out of crowds, even more so because more people can likely get infected from these variants. In terms of immune evasion, we don't panic. Let me say that again. We don't panic. This does not mean that anybody who's been vaccinated or anybody who's had COVID and recovered is now going to run the risk of getting serious illness and finding themselves in the hospital. Again, partial effectiveness is still effectiveness. It's the same conversation we had on the flip side of the board. And many of the vaccine makers are already working on ways to develop booster shots that specifically fine-tune the immune response for these particular variants. Boosters may not even be needed, but it's good to know that they are thinking and preparing for that in the likelihood that we decide we need to take that step. So, we be cautious. We are cautious, not we be cautious. We stay cautious. We keep watching the data. But I don't think this is something that we panic about. There's a lot more data published about this. You can find that. Here are 3 great references if you want to dig deeper into that. There are lots of other places you can look to, but I really like the way these explain vaccine effectiveness and the impact of the variants. That was a whole lot of science we just went through, everybody. Thank you for sticking with me. Share this with somebody that you think might also have these same kinds of questions. Thank you for watching Shareable Science Beyond the Blog. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Take care.